So I was reading your article. I can't remember where it was published, but you were talking about bringing back a kind of, and I don't know if this is the word exactly that you used, but a kind of provincialism in style. So in this particular article, you were talking about the dressing environment that you kind of like live in and trying to reacquaint people with dressing a particular way in a particular place. I can't remember the exact language that you use, but do you know the article that I'm referring to?
Yeah, you're talking about the opinion piece that I wrote for the Deseret News, which is one of the local newspapers here in Utah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to grasp is you think that we will be able to, or what you're trying to argue or encourage people to do is that to find unique kind of subcultures of dress in the places that they live. And so could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I think that there are quite a few upsides to globalization. There are a lot of things that are really positives of it. And I think at the same time, there are a lot of costs that come with globalization as well. And one of those things is we get this complete homogenization of culture where I can eat the same foods here that I do anywhere else, or downtown Salt Lake has the same type of architecture as you would get in Denver or in New York or in Beijing or anywhere else, other than the kind of like one-off random buildings. It's all just glass skyscrapers and it's all the same. And we're experiencing the same thing when it comes to clothing. Is everything has become largely homogenous, and people start to feel like they're just part of this great big blob of humanity. And again, there are upsides to that of not having the tribalism and the us versus them, or the, we're different than you. But at the same time, there are costs associated with that as well. And it is sad to see how much true diversity we lose with this homogenization of culture. And I think that one of the things that people should continue to do is embrace things that are local and unique. And part of that includes their clothing. And you should really find ways to lean into that, so that the style in Utah is different than it is in Colorado, which is different than it is in Mexico, which is different than it is in Japan. And it should be different that way.
Okay, this is what fascinates me. How do you think that is possible?
I think what it really comes down to is some measure of intentionality. I don't think that happens on accident anymore, where you have to get people to really kind of embrace a local culture or embrace a subculture. And, I think a lot of this even comes from my experience being involved with punk rock, because that was an incredibly intentional counterculture. And the aesthetics were all driven off of being offensive. And when you look at other very intentional countercultures, whether that's the Amish, or you get like very Orthodox Hasidic Jews, or you get social justice warriors, or anything where their entire aesthetic ethos is, we do not want to look like we fit into the mainstream. We want to look like outsiders. And I don't think that every state or every city or every subculture you find on the internet or anything else needs to go to that extreme. They're at 100%, but you should have a good 30, 40% of, I don't want to look like the rest of you. I want to maintain what's unique about me and where I am. And I think everywhere or every little subculture should embrace that. And what that looks like is going to be very different. The way that's developed is going to be largely organic, where, the way that I was talking about it in the articles, and where I am in Utah, we've got Mormon pioneer heritage, and you've got Native American heritage, and you've got this kind of like tech culture boom that's happening. And you've got this massive outdoors culture with skiing and climbing and all of these other things. And there are really cool, unique combinations that we could create by taking elements of all four of those. But instead, here we just try to dress like we wish we were in California, because then maybe those companies will validate us instead. And it's a waste. It's a waste of our potential, and it's a waste of our identity.
I guess I would call into question to what extent. I agree with you. Like, I would like to see more diversity in the way that people dress. Absolutely. I'm 100% on board with it. I think where I start to call that into question is that I was having this conversation with a man named Heinrich Wilberg, and he was talking about how it is that he learned how to dress. And part of his learning how to dress experience was actually visiting through Europe at a time when globalization was not as pervasive as it is now. And so he would go into, like, for example, these little towns in Italy where they had very distinctive ways of dressing. But the reason why they were able to kind of develop this little subculture of dressing is that they could only actually get the items that were in their immediate vicinity, because there wasn't something like
creativity.
Sorry, go ahead.
Scarcity creates creativity.
Could you explain?
They're limited in what their access is, as far as not only the physical resources, but the design options or anything else. And so what it does is it just expands and expands on itself until it really spins out into its own very small subculture. And when you have access to all these other things, that doesn't happen. It's the same thing with any sort of scarcity. If you tell me that I can use any medium to create art, then I'm not going to create something nearly as effective as if you tell me if I have to paint or I have to sculpt or I have to use colored pencil. That limitation is what actually stems that creativity. And so it would make sense that he would go to these small Italian towns where they are very limited in what they have access to, the materials that they can use, the design elements that they can pull from, the language that they speak, the religion that they believe in, all of these things, that it's so small and so focused. And that's what's going to create this very unique aesthetic for them.
Yes, but it's also that they only have access, right, which is a situation that we don't have now, because if you have access to the internet, you could almost get anything from anywhere. Like, for example, right now I'm wearing a Neapolitan sport coat that has soft spalacamica shoulders, right? So at one point in time, you could only actually get a jacket like this in Italy.
And not even just in Italy, in parts of Italy, like in Florence versus being in Milan, because it was that specific. Yeah,
precisely. And so I guess what I'm trying to understand is, given that we now have the internet and given that globalization is as pervasive as it is, how is it that we are going to work to develop these unique subcultures of style?
I think part of it is that as we continue to see more and more cultural balkanization on the internet, where you see actual rejection of completely different ideologies. And so you get into these same kind of limited spaces, and it's not limited by virtue of what you have access to, so much as it's limited by virtue of what you want to give yourself access to. And as you continue to stay in those, really, I guess, for lack of a better term, those bubbles. I mean, you see this all the time with lingo. Lingo is a really good example of this, where you go on to different subreddits, or you go into different Telegram chats or different channels, and the idioms that they use or the acronyms that they use, they don't make any sense to anybody that isn't already super steeped in that culture. And so it becomes a way to not only separate the us from the them, but also to even more deeply integrate the us with the us. And to me, it makes sense that you will see a natural expression of that as things move out from just being on the internet to being in real life as well. And so we will see aesthetic versions of that jargon or of those signals, and we'll see it in clothing just as much as we see it in chat rooms or on Telegram.